Robin Macpherson is an assistant rector at Dollar Academy in Scotland, where he teaches history. He has worked in Scotland, England, and the Emirates, spent 7 years as the head of history, and has been an examiner for the SQA, EdXL, and the IBO. I hope everyone knows what this means, because I certainly don't. But since I'm here, since I arrived in the UK, I know that you love abbreviations and acronyms. He was content director of the Telegraph Festival of Education and is currently organizing Research Ed in Scotland, which will be taking place 22nd of September. He co-authored What Does This Look Like in the Classroom, Bridging the Gap Between Research and Practice, together with Carl Hendrick, and is working on a book entitled The Research-Informed Teacher. He has also published history textbooks for Cambridge University Press. He's a board member of the educational charity Remembering Srebrenica Scotland and chairs the education committee. Thank you very much for coming today, and this is your microphone.
Put myself in. Right. Well, before we kick start, I just want to get a sense of who's here today and actually what we can do to sort of tailor this a little bit to, I suppose, your issues or questions about assessment. So how many people are here from the university or university? Quite a few. Is it different departments? Who have we got? Nursing, other ones? Life sciences? Law, yeah. Educational technologists, okay. Can I just ask you, generally at university, how do you find pupils coming out of school and into university when it comes to how you assess them? Are they ready for that, do you think? In any kind of aspect, do you think there's any strengths that they have coming out of the school system to come to you? Or are we getting it wrong? They follow the rules? Or our students, yeah, I think ours do as well, yeah. What do you think, if you could change something or give them a better skill set, what would you want to see them doing when they're tackling university level assessment? Thinking? Good entry level requirement.
Not the answer, but try to create and justify a solution.
I like that.
Not necessarily the correct thing.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. I had a conversation tail end of last week, actually, my colleagues in the history department, we were talking about that with the move from higher into advanced higher in history, which is exactly where people start to come unstuck, where doing exactly what you're saying, it's kind of like, tell me what the knowledge point is. In actual fact, you need to think a bit more deeply about that and come up with your own ones. There's not a set answer, which...
From a science point of view, students come out of school thinking that science is a load of facts, and spend the first 2 years trying to point out how little we actually know, how insecure those facts actually are.
Interesting. Do you spend much time looking at what goes on in schools to see why they're like that?
We've recently been revising our level 1, level 2 curriculum, and yes, we have had meetings with teachers to discuss what actually goes on there, and a lot of it's the fault of the curriculum and the way it's assessed.
Right.
Because we can give the students exactly the same questions they get, say in higher biology, same diagrams, exactly the same wording. You get very different answers all the way to one of them.
Really? Okay. Is that a common feeling?
I would say what was like interesting is that she was asked what's the knowledge point, because I sometimes feel that I'm not really speaking the same language as them, and I could go to school that long ago. It seems that school has changed so much since I was there that I think when I was at school I would never have asked what's the knowledge point. So to me that's like, what is that? And so it kind of feels a bit of a disconnect with what they're expecting. And us maybe not understanding what that means to students.
Yeah, I think one of the problems which may or may not come out of this, I do feel that the more I've spent time preparing this talk, the more I thought, wow, I'm really skimming the surface here. There's so much more depth and complexity we can go into. So it is, by its nature, quite broad brush, but I thought given that we've got people from schools and universities, and this is a great initiative, by the way, Tyle, getting us together to talk about this in common. I would love to see that happening an awful lot more, so I'm really trying to champion this as much as I can whenever I go and speak in places or putting out on Twitter, because I think we need to have this dialogue. We have got common problems and we need to talk about them. And one of the issues I think, which is, I've seen it a lot over my career, is that to get better results, there's always a push on schools to get results. You are teaching children how to use rubrics, and they're starting to throw out teacher vocabulary back at you that I didn't use when I was at school. I never saw the mark scheme. My teacher told me what a good essay was like from the point of view, how do you want to become a good writer? And now I do it myself. We go through the mark scheme. So what does this actually mean? We try and turn it into language students will understand, but then that does end up with them thinking these are the rules of the game. I want to know if I'm offside or not. And that's kind of frustrating, isn't it?
What's often bizarre though is we try and get them to look at marketing scriptures, and I put them on all my modules, I put them up on the board. We talk through, I started doing examples of here's an exam answer, and this is what it got, and they take bits of it to show them what that translated into. And I get so many students who come in and say, oh, I'm just using marks, which is odd that in schools they get quite good at it. But we have, so there just seems to be so many things that are absurd as what happens between the two, that I think maybe we should be asking the students what is going on.
Yeah, it makes you really question whether knowledge that's going in is transferable, and can they perform in different contexts under different pressures and so on, and how durable is what they're actually learning. This.
It's the freedom when you've got out from under forgotten to do what you told them to do.
They're still asking what do they need to know rather
Yeah.
than what they need to understand.
Mhm.
And that's the biggest change. Many of them who perform extremely well at school then struggle as they try and progress through university because they're still very good at knowing, but not very good at actually understanding.
For the benefit of people who are kind of watching this on the web stream, I suppose you're probably not hearing the answers that are coming back, but the point there, students want to know what do they need to know rather than what do they need to understand, and I think that's absolutely a huge problem. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. Yes, thinking hard. The phrase desirable difficulties will crop up in this, so we'll run through some of this sort of stuff, and we'll see where we get. If anyone's here with a philosophical background, I'm afraid this is not a massive amount about Sisyphus. It's just kind of a way into the issue to try and it's something that occurred to me. So I've titled it The Myth of Sisyphus, Assessment and Absurdity, because the more I think about the issues that crop up with assessment and some of the practices you see going on, the more you think that is absurd. It's a word that recurs quite a lot. So there's a lot to think about in common. So we're talking about the absurd. This is what Camus sets out in his philosophy. He says there's a fundamental tension between what we want to find in life and what we actually find. And so he's probably not the cheeriest of guys, because he says what we really want is meaning and order. Wouldn't that be lovely? But he's saying that doesn't exist. What actually exists is chaos. So that leaves you with two fundamental choices. So you can either take a leap of faith into thinking things will be better, or you can realize it's all miserable and you can just end it all. So suicide is a big part of this. We're not going to stray into that sort of territory today. But Camus does point out that there is a third way, and this is why he uses Sisyphus as his example. And the third way is that you can actually realize that the life is about chaos and it's about struggle, and there's not a lot in the way of hope or meaning, and that once you actually get over that and embrace it, that is the route to true happiness. That's where acceptance leads you to a better understanding of things, and then you can have a better human experience. So that's sort of the gist of what he's writing about in this essay. And so at the end, he talks about Sisyphus as being the ultimate example of the absurd hero. So poor old Sisyphus is condemned to push this boulder uphill for eternity, and when he gets to the top, it rolls back down again, and he just has to keep on repeating it. So I've actually forgot to dig this out of the bag. I'm going to read you a little bit and just give you an idea of why I decided to use this analogy, why it kind of spoke to me. So this is just a page and a bit where Camus outlines what Sisyphus did. Hope I got my right page. Here we go. So the gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling a rock to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back of its own weight. They had thought with some reason that there is no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor. You'll see where I'm going with this fairly soon. If one believes Homer, Sisyphus was the wisest and most prudent of mortals. According to another tradition, however, he was disposed to practice the profession of the highwayman. I see no contradiction in this. Opinions differ as to reasons why he became the futile laborer of the underworld. To begin with, he's accused of a certain levity in regard to the gods. He stole their secrets. Aegina, the daughter of Aesopus, was carried off by Jupiter. The father was shocked by that disappearance and complained to Sisyphus. He, who knew of the abduction, offered to tell about it, on condition that Sisyphus would give water to the citadel of Corinth. To the celestial thunderbolts, he preferred the benediction of water. Love that phrase. He was punished for this in the underworld, and Homer tells us also that Sisyphus had put death in chains. Pluto could not endure the sight of his deserted, silent empire. He dispatched the god of war who liberated death from the hands of her conqueror. But it's also said that Sisyphus, being near to death, rashly wanted to test his wife's love. He ordered her to cast his unburied body into the middle of the public square. Sisyphus woke up in the underworld, and there, annoyed by an obedience so contrary to human love, he obtained from Pluto permission to return to Earth in order to chastise his wife. But when he had seen again the face of the world, enjoyed water and sun, warm stones in the sea, he no longer wanted to go back to the infernal darkness. Recalls, signs of anger, warnings were of no avail. Many years more, he lived facing the curve of the gulf, the sparkling sea, and the smiles of earth. A decree of the gods was necessary. Mercury came and seized the impudent man by the collar, and snatching him from his joys, led him forcibly back to the underworld where his rock was ready for him. So we kind of put all of this together, then we get this picture of Sisyphus as a guy, he really loves life, he thumbs his nose a little bit at authority, he tries to put the collective good before himself a little bit. He's really very human, and I get the feeling that this guy could easily register with the GTCS. There's a lot that Sisyphus has in common with us teachers. We do basically put ourselves out there for the greater good. And instead of having a boulder, we teachers have this. We have this marking pile. It goes up and up and up. And as soon as you clear it, again, the boulder rolls back down the hill and you have to do it all over again. And you have to think, is this actually working or is this just futile? If Camus is right, then what we need to do is keep on doing this and realize there is no hope, there's no other way to do it, and that's the only way we're ever going to be happy is if we accept the misery and we buy into it. And that's where Camus' famous last line to this essay is, one must imagine Sisyphus happy, that actually Sisyphus gets his revenge in his own little way on the gods by embracing his task and saying, fine, I will keep on doing this, and actually I won't see it as a punishment. And what I want to do is disagree with that and say that teachers don't have to keep on shoving the boulder up the hill. We can do things differently. There is hope. I'm at odds with Camus in that much as I like him. I think there are other ways of doing things. We don't need to keep on doing this for eternity. So very, very quickly, and I'll skip over this, I think we all get this. Purpose of assessment, a lot of what I'm talking about here is really about assessment for learning, which I think is the single most important initiative in education in the last quarter century, probably, at least in Britain anyway. And of course, it stems from Dylan Wiliam's work with Paul Black, Inside the Black Box, focusing on, what did I do, what did they learn? So, Dylan launched this, and he talks about it really in a really interesting way, saying that he launched this in the UK, it became official government policy, he went away to work in the States, and when he came back, he was amazed at what had been done to his work. He felt it had been bastardized, and that this was a real tragedy, and he finds it really upsetting. So, sort of core principles, wrong lines of providing evidence for teacher decisions, we'll see how that went wrong. Feedback for pupils to improve, we can see how that's actually a bit of a minefield. The power of peer assessment, and there's a bit of a tip I'll give you later on that one, but that's something that's sometimes used well, sometimes used very badly. And then producing self-regulating learners. Do we have self-regulating learners at university? Do we think? Sometimes. What do you take it to mean, self-regulating learners? It's a phrase that crops up an awful lot, and don't often hear people challenging what it means. Mm-hmm. Self-motivated. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, ones that actively seek it out. Yeah, that's interesting. Anything else?
Get a sense of have they actually learned what they were aiming to learn. So it's cognitive awareness of the learning.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That cognitive or metacognitive awareness of their own learning and how they're going. So in other words, those pupils that hand in a bit of work to you and say, I've got no idea if this is any good or not. Self-regulated learners should have an awareness if they've done a good bit of work, because they actually know how they're making progress, they know how they're learning, so they know when they produce something that's of quality as opposed to something not. So I think one of the big problems we have in schools is we're not producing these self-regulating learners, because when they suddenly get into university, they really struggle. I mean, how many of your students at university change course in the first year? Does that happen a lot? Do you have a lot of dropout? 5%? Well, that's okay, that's lower than I thought it might be. So in other words, they actually, you might put them in a different course within university, or they might transfer university altogether. Does that happen a lot? Mm.
Because we run multiple degree streams,
Mm-hmm.
life sciences, so transferring between those, I would have some change in foundations, but then say coming in to do life sciences and going to do nursing, that would be a change.
That would be a change, yeah.
And I've had students do that, students go to the accountancy, students go to students who just weren't ready and didn't continue.
Because it's quite a... Yeah.
Ironically, teacher education, we both work in that setting there, we don't get people moving because the government caps the places that they're funding. They really don't want people moving because that has an impact on us. So the one course at the university where people come in at 17 don't move on
And don't budge.
when they're getting up.
Is ITE. How interesting. Okay. Because that's what I was quite curious to know, because as schools, we don't really know what happens to our pupils after they leave. Not enough school, well, actually hardly anybody, I know a couple of schools are now starting to do this, but actually track what happens to their pupils to find out if what they're doing up to age 17, 18 is working. So in other words, do they get through the degree? Do they actually stick with the degree that they've applied for through UCAS in the first place? How well do they do in the degree? Do they go on into further employment? So what does that look like once you're beyond tertiary education? Because we genuinely don't know that. And you probably have a much better picture of what you think people are like at 19, 20, 21 as learners than we do as schools. And I think that's a big missing piece of evidence that I hope we'll know a lot more about in the future. So anyway, we'll come back to self-regulating learners. So this is by no means a comprehensive list, but these are some of the issues. Feel free to add to them if you like. One is that a lot of assessment is just driven by a need to acquire data. And this is part of an accountability and performance culture that applies to both the pupils and it applies to the teachers. It's where we get value added from and things like that. It's where I worked in a school before where the director of studies published the value-added exam results of all the teachers in a top-to-bottom order to show kind of best and worst within the school, which obviously caused a fair bit of anxiety and horror amongst the teaching staff. So in other words, it's seeing assessment as a great way to get some numbers that we can crunch, and then we can do something useful with that, and we can show parents what we're doing and everything else. In actual fact, if we're really driving assessment through the prism of data, then we're using it in a very limited way that actually is probably increasing the anxiety of pupils as well as of our staff. So that's one of the big problems I see. I have managed to cut back, and I think successfully, a lot of the data I collect through assessment, and I feel happier in doing that because I feel that I don't need to put a number on every bit of work that gets done. I don't need to spend lots of time in spreadsheets. I can spend more time thinking about what I'm actually going to say to the pupil in the lesson, and that's a beneficial thing. Data is still useful, but it's not the only game in town. This is Daisy Christodoulou, so her book, Making Good Progress, is a very good read. Of course, it's specific to England, but it'd be nice to have something equivalent to it in Scotland. And she talks about assessment for learning, which she says, although AFL's aim was to use assessment to help pupils learn, rather than to produce grades, in the worst cases, it actually ended up encouraging teaching to the test and over-frequent grading. So that's what we've been discussing already. The value of exam tasks was overestimated, and other types of assessment were undervalued. So that's where we've sort of ended up in the last 10, 15, 20 years with a sort of drift towards thou shalt know the mark scheme, and you will know the exact way to write a paragraph, or you will know exactly how to navigate this to hit the right grade boundary. Pupils knowing what grade boundaries are tells us a lot about how data-driven things are and how we emphasize the summative and big exams, high-stakes testing. So I think Daisy's got a point there. And this does lead to the fact that if we've put too much weight on high-stakes testing, then it's probably a major reason why pupils are anxious as teenagers. So I hear it so much, they're saying, oh, we're seeing so much more in the way of pupil anxiety, and they're unhappy, and more issues with mental health. Must be social media's fault. They're on Facebook too much. I wonder if it's to do with the way they're being taught in school, the fact that they have so much in the way of high-stakes assessment that actually they go from one pressure situation to another, to another, to another, and they're having to perform all the time. There's more performance than there is learning, and the outcome, as we were mentioning earlier on, is that you get pupils who say, I need to know what the answer is so I can perform, rather than I need to know what it is I should understand. So the emphasis is on kind of regurgitating rather than thinking. And that's just, again, the way the overall system has that culture that means that we think a bit more about high stakes than we do about low stakes. And again, something I've tried to change in my teaching the last 2 or 3 years is doing a lot more in the way of low stakes, and also trying to drop down the language I use when I talk about pupils doing summative assessment, and saying to them, actually, this is practice. You know, this is not kind of like the final grade. This is going to live with you for the rest of your life. This is practice to move on and get better. So trying to think about how we package this for students is an important aspect of getting it better. Primary testing, I'm going to spend a long time on this because it's very on talk and it's very on minefield, but always very topical. I think there's an interesting difference between Scotland and England on this. I've just come back to Scotland. I've only been working back here since last August, having been in England for 6 years, and it's amazing to see how many things are going on in England that we don't have in Scotland, but are really ramping up anxiety for both teachers and pupils. But the way we go about collecting big data and baseline testing of our youngest students is really quite different in what we're trying to do with it. So in pupils, we've got the National Improvement Framework, and testing is done in P1, P4, P7, and S3. Things are externally marked, it's done electronically, it's done very quickly, so teachers don't carry the burden of that. Feedback is given to teachers, and they can kind of do it at any time of the year. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment this is a perfect system, but when you contrast it to what's going on in England, where they do it end of key stage, so it's primary 2 and primary 6. Primary 2 has to be marked by the teachers, workload. Primary 6 is marked externally, but the results are sent to the parents. And you have a narrow window of assessment, so the P6 ones are treated a little bit like terminal exams, so it's kind of like exam season the same way you have with GCSEs or A-levels. And then that data is used to rank the schools by league tables. And pupils who don't do well at this keep on being retested. They have to go through the process again and again and again. And this is the primary pupils we're talking about who are hiring tutors to try and get them through the tests. This seems amazing to me. Schools are putting on revision sessions for kids in primary 6 so they can perform better in a high stakes test. Really quite. Primary 6, yeah, 11. Yeah, 10, 11. As many times as they need to get them to the level they need to be at. I mean, official levels have gone, but it's amazing seeing teachers on Twitter complaining about my child has just done this, and I think it's awful. It's quite remarkable. So you're looking...
Retesting.
Yeah.
Kind of test going on at the moment. It's a national test on the same day. Everyone sits to reading and writing, whatever
Yeah.
it might be. On that day, they'll do loads and loads of prep and practice tests. You can find them online, it's quite hard as well.
Yeah. They're more robust. Yes, they're tougher. It's better.
The spag test, this spelling
Yeah.
and grammar, front and verbal, this sort of stuff. I took it to some of our language specialists. This is designed for 10-year-olds to teach education, language. I struggle with some of it.
Yeah. What do you think is the benefit of that if we're trying to play devil's advocate? Is there any benefit in the English system?
I think there is.
For pupils, let's start with them. What's good about it?
This is entirely my opinion. Having taught in England under this system,
Yeah.
one of the reasons I left, Ofsted use it. They use
Yeah.
data, and they go into schools. If you're underperforming, you'll get poor scores. They will be all over you. I don't like the Ofsted approach at all. What I think it's done is it's put huge pressure on weaker teachers. I think there was a group of weaker teachers, grade primary, and was the one that got person from South Science School. I think it put pressure on everything.
Interesting.
Phenomenal pressure on everything else, on the parents and the children. So,
In that sense, there's not a bit of overkill just to target those teachers. I mean, obviously there are other ways to deal with underperforming teachers, but yeah.
and that's my opinion with us.
Yeah. And this is it. I mean, good luck throwing opinions out on this on Twitter either way, really, because somebody will jump on you. But it's worth having a think about this. I do think it's valuable to collect baseline data about pupils to see how they perform over a long period of time. I think that's valuable. But I don't think it helps them to put them through this kind of high-stakes accountability thing, that they end up fearing school and not enjoying learning. I think that's a really terrible message to send out to primary children. So I much prefer the Scottish system. Say, again, I'm not a primary teacher, so I don't want to claim to be an expert on this, but I think I would go the left-hand column over the right-hand column every day of the week.
How does this mean for the actual pupils? So obviously it matters to the schools
Sure.
how well pupils perform, because that determines how they go on the league tables. And for that reason, they will then retest the pupils. But does it mean anything to the pupils? Does it affect their progression to better the
In terms of their awareness of it, I think in the Scottish system, no, they just kind of carry on, and this goes on in the background in a way. But on the English side of things, yeah, I think it really depends on the pupil, perhaps on the overall school culture as well. For some pupils, if their parents don't care about this, they might not care about it and saying, well, why am I going to do this? But for others, especially with parents who've got quite high demands and high expectations, this is a lot of stress and anxiety for them. And they receive something at home that says, this is the national average and this is where you are, above or below.
Is it not the case that there is some feedback from some parents who withdraw their children from the SATs test?
Yeah.
But for example, does a pupil's SAT affect where they go to secondary school or
No.
anything?
No.
I mean, it really doesn't matter.
It's not supposed to.
Yeah.
But there are rumours that some schools, because there's a lot more sort of choice aware, you choose in Scotland, there's a lot more choice in England, people going all over the place ranking the schools and this. And I think what happens is there are suggestions that some schools are.
Well, you've got this kind of weaponized data, don't you? And people are going to use it. It's absurd, isn't it?
There was a union-led boycott around 2010. Some
Yeah.
schools boycotted it. Ofsted came to see them very quickly.
Mhm.
And they said, we want to teach better. And they went over those schools very, very quickly to see whether it's sort of scrutiny. And in a lot of cases,
I do think happier things are happening under Amanda Spielman. I'm a fan of her, and things like not grading, lesson observation, and so on. So Ofsted is changing in its nature, but it does make me think. Thank goodness I work in Scotland, to be honest. People were amazed when I came up from England. I said I'm looking forward to working in Scotland again. I know people say there are problems with all the rest of it, but wow, trying to explain academies and multi-academy trusts and free schools and everything else and SATs and all the things that are driving teachers around the bend in England. We have fewer problems in Scotland. I won't say they're not significant ones, but I think we have fewer overall problems.
I think they also use that's the question for setting streaming when they go to secondary. But then you hear stories of secondary schools retesting because they don't trust the data from the primary school.
That's where the retesting comes in, yeah, absolutely. So anyway, we could, as I say, that's a whole other lecture. Maybe that's one for another day, but we're just throwing that out as an example of some of the absurdity, especially in primacy. And this is a bit of a bugbear of mine, is that formative and summative assessment should be clearly distinct things. But there's a question of whether formative assessment is really fit for purpose. What sort of tasks are we getting pupils to do, and how are we using that to progress their learning? And then with summative assessment, is it actually sort of targeting a whole domain? And I think that's part of the structure of our system that maybe it's not. That's what it's meant to do. So in other words, my thing here is that a lot of what is meant to be formative assessment is kind of summative in disguise, and that causes some problems. And again, that's ramping up the anxiety for children, because it means that the tasks they're being asked to do are ones that they're maybe not yet equipped to do, and so they're finding shortcuts to be able to do that. And if that becomes their habit as learners, then that carries on until very much later on. So again, I'm really skimming the surface on that. That's a talk for a whole other day as well. I mean, every slide in this kind of is, but that's just my feeling as a teacher. And I've seen quite a lot of different teaching as well. Having worked in a teaching school alliance, which had 18 different schools, I visited a lot of them and saw a lot of different things going on, a lot of very different practice. But that was just something I picked up on over a few years of doing that. And this is what I will call a sort of Scottish dissonance, where we have in senior phase here our kind of rush from National 5 through to higher, through to advanced higher. So this is all about, kind of a lot of exams going on there. I know that we do fewer National 5s as we did in the past compared to sort of standard grades, but still you are looking at doing the highers and advanced highers and collecting quite a lot of qualifications, sitting a lot of exams. And there's a real rush to get through everything. You've got to sprint through the content, and then you've got to practice it. And then our pupils are currently doing all of this in May right now. So that's all about the kind of rapid get through an exam system, sprinting to learn type culture. That's actually the antithesis of everything that's meant to go on in the broad general education. So that's again, we're kind of saying this is all about interdisciplinary learning and thinking harder and deeper learning and understanding. And it's like bang, bang, bang. Get your facts down on paper and rattle through it as quickly as you can. So it seems to me that we do have a dissonance there between what goes on up until the senior phase. It's almost as if kind of at S4 things completely change and the culture changes, and no wonder pupils are kind of coming out after hires and advanced hires feeling that they'd be kind of in some sort of educational tumble dryer, and then are they ready for university? Well, they've certainly done an awful lot of exams, but the level of thinking that you want them to be doing, is our system getting that out of them? Well, maybe it is in some cases, but across the board, I don't know, it's an open question. So, and shifting the goalposts, this is where I think it's really difficult. If we're talking about teacher stress in Scotland, a sad fact is there were over 700 teacher vacancies unfilled at the start of this academic year across Scotland, and we've got approximately 50,000 teachers working in this country. So that's an incredible shortage of teachers. And so why have we got a recruitment problem? Why have we got a retention problem? Why are people leaving the profession, especially young teachers leaving the profession? That is really, really worrying for the long-term health of our system. And it hasn't helped that there has been so much change in Scotland, and it's still changing, that this is what leads to the stress and the workload and the anxiety and everything else. And at some point it's got to stop. So this is just one sample of how things have changed this year. Unit assessments have been scrapped at National 5. So that means that 28 of the 42 subjects have got longer exams. And again, think of the impact of that on pupils. So
2 hours and 20 minutes for a National 5 religious knowledge or possible studies exam. And these people have never sat an exam before.
Absolutely.
2 hours and 20 minutes is what they're expected to sit in one go without a break.
Same for history.
They're doing that
Yeah.
for 28 May, they're not ready for that.
No. Isn't that amazing? The first proper exam that you sit is 2 hours and 20 minutes long. Wow. That's incredible. Yeah. So pupils in my school who are doing 7 National 5s, I looked at this, I didn't crunch numbers exactly, but they will spend the same amount of time in the exam room as I did when I sat my finals at Oxford. Isn't that nuts? What's wrong with that? It just amazes me that that's the case. So everything's getting longer. About the same? Yeah. Long. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing that is the case. So think of the effect that has on teachers trying to prepare for this. Unit assessments were scrapped to try and reduce teacher workload, but not for having to do lots extra and teach more to deal with longer assessments. So we just can move the problem somewhere else into a higher stakes area. And that's where 9 subjects are now picked up exams where they didn't have them before. So one of the things I really appreciated in working for the IBO, that's the International Baccalaureate, is that it's really, really different working in a system that is not connected to a government. The IB runs like clockwork, and it has been running like clockwork. Well, it's Swiss, so it would do, I suppose. It's been running like clockwork for years. It goes back to the 60s. There's been no grade inflation at all for the last 25 years. So final scores are out of 45. So if somebody gets 37, you know that a 37 now is kind of the same as a 37 was 20 years ago. And curriculum reform is done on an 8-year cycle. So history was reviewed in 2015, and because they were reviewing it from 8 years ago, they tweaked it based on teacher feedback, because at the end of every exam cycle, teachers give feedback saying, we didn't like that question, we don't like the coursework, but we like that, keep that, etc. So they tweaked it, and in 8 years again, 2023, history will be reviewed, and again in 2031, and so on. And because they're not accountable to a government, elections make no difference to this whatsoever. It's kind of like working for an NGO. So actually, you know where you stand with that. It's nice and straightforward. And it's very difficult, actually. I think the IB, to get 45 points in IB is outrageous. Not only do you need to be incredibly clever, but very, very highly motivated and organised. I think only 0.18% of pupils worldwide get the full mark in IB. So, if you've got a pupil who's got 5 A's at higher, are they as good as that pupil who's also got 5 A's at higher? There's actually quite a big disparity between them. Some can kind of scrape over the line or be taught to the test and everything else, and others can be genuine deep thinkers and scholars, and we've got a real difference between the two, but they've got the same results on paper, but they wouldn't with IB. So I quite like IB. Whenever I mention it up here, most people are horrified. It's like, oh, I don't like IB, you can't specialise and all this kind of stuff. It's all nonsense, but we've never been interested in it in Scotland, and I still don't know why that is. Anyway, I thought. Problems with feedback. So God bless him, John Hattie. He's done very well out of all things in the last few years. We interviewed. You'll probably be familiar with this. Interviewed a group of teachers for a post earlier this year, and actually 9 out of 10 of them were probationers. So I don't know why that was. It was just an unusual thing. So one of the questions we asked them was, like, what educational research have you read and that you find interesting would use in the classroom? 9 out of 10, John Hattie, absolutely. go for John. One of them said Black and Wiliam, which was fantastic. He was like, you gave me a good answer there, well done. But still, he's the main man in town, and he's saying the most powerful single modification that enhances achievement is feedback. And if you have a look at all of his data and effect sizes and so on, feedback's kind of way up there. And everyone's like, right, let's do lots on feedback. And when his book became popular, that was the thing that everybody had to do. But it's not quite as straightforward as that.
Wait, can I ask a question? When you asked that question about research, did any of them suggest weaknesses or criticisms at all of the research?
And again, I was sat there wanting to probe this deeper, and I just thought this is not really that fair. You guys are just out there, and I don't want to kind of like take you to town on this one. But still, I was just interested to see that they actually know a bit of research and they can articulate it in a way that sort of matches up a little bit. So, but I was sort of sitting there going, I really want to go further with this, but no, we moved on to other things. So anyway, with feedback, it can be very effective. It can be high impact, but it can also have no impact whatsoever, especially if it's vague. So the type of feedback you give really makes a very, very big difference on this. And it can also be unwanted, in that if pupils know that they've tanked something, to hand back a bit of work or to say to them, yeah, you got that horribly wrong, they know that. You're sort of reinforcing that negativity. So feedback, you've got to be done with quite a lot of skill, I think, to get it right. And actually, it takes quite a long time as a teacher to get good at this. I still see very experienced teachers giving feedback where I slightly feel, well, it was a bit generalized, but nebulous, or perhaps maybe you should have held back on that a little bit. The pupil knows they've got this horribly wrong. So let's just think very carefully what we say to them about that. I'm not talking about treating with kid gloves. I'm talking about making the feedback effective, and that's a different thing. And then there's also the frequency of feedback, and here's where we're, again, coming back to the thing we talked about at the start, people being ready for university. There should be a tapering off of it. Otherwise, we end up with learned helplessness. So that's why I asked the question about, do students come to your university and then change what they're doing? Because in the first year, they decide that they're not actually historians, they want to do something else. Because I think a lot of the time, pupils are inspired by a teacher that they really love, and they see them through school, and they get lots of high-impact feedback from them, and they think, right, I love the subject because of that teacher. And then when they go to a different environment, and they don't have that crutch anymore, that teacher propping them up all the way, they suddenly can't quite do it by themselves, and that self-regulation thing isn't quite there. So we don't quite know how to taper off the feedback, because we should have to give a bit less of it to try and develop independence and independent learners, which again is another one of those nebulous concepts we should attack on another day. But if you're giving a high level of feedback, and actually more frequent feedback towards the end of school, then you're going to see pupils who are really going to struggle when they go into courses with far bigger numbers, and they're getting less in the way of feedback. They need to be ready for that environment. So that's one of the problems we have in a system where we've got big exams in S4, S5, S6, and it's hard to taper the feedback in that situation. So that's one of the issues I have. So is it increasing, is it decreasing, is it consistent? It should ideally be decreasing towards the end of a school pupil's educational life there. And then Dylan Wiliam saying, too many teachers focus on the purpose of feedback as changing or improving the work, whereas the major purpose of feedback should be to improve the students. I think that's a great bit of advice. Whenever we put this out on Twitter, it's amazing how a minority of people come back and say, well, I do that anyway. Of course I do that. Who doesn't do that? And lots of other people saying, no, that's pretty much actually the culture of how feedback works in my school. So it's a cultural shift that we need to think about. And that makes a very big difference to how you take in a bit of work and what you do with it when you give it back to a pupil or give them a task in a lesson. So that's a good reminder to have. And Dylan talks about actually cites Douglas Reeves on this. He says that when you give this sort of feedback about what is wrong with the piece of work and the students don't have an opportunity to respond to it, he says very much the difference between getting a medical, where you're advised what to do next, and a post-mortem saying why you died. So he said too much feedback is of the post-mortem variety. When in actual fact, it should be about looking what you're going to do next and how you're going to improve your morbidity. Which brings us on to some of the happier stuff, how to make things better. And again, this is a really short sort of list of things. It's definitely not a fix everything, but some ideas as to how we can do it a little bit better. Dylan says he wished he'd used the phrase responsive teaching instead of assessment for learning. Because again, as he went away and then came back and discovered that assessment for learning was about an obsession with assessment to create data and set people on levels and all this kind of stuff. He said that the point of assessment is to actually give a pupil a chance to respond to the feedback they've been given so they can get better. So responsive teaching is what he really talks about much more so now. And I like this one, Robert Bjork, big fan of his work. about reducing stakes, that low stakes or no stakes testing is key to optimizing learning. I love that. I wish we could have so much more in the way of low stakes or no stakes assessment that is kind of more about people practicing. Yeah.
The impact we find of doing no stakes assessment is that it doesn't. Students just don't engage. They're
Right.
very, very grade motivated. There is nothing associated. There's no outcome associated with it. Very few will do it just because of the sake of learning.
If schools started doing this, though, would that change what you're seeing?
I hope it will change attitudes.
Yeah.
It may be because they've been trained that way at school. At school, they've been trained.
Trained to focus on the things that matter,
Focus on
which is
some of the
great.
assessments.
Yeah. If the culture of your school life education is it's a high stakes or nothing, you're not going to change the way you approach it at university.
1% contribution on that, and it totally changes their attitude to it.
Interesting.
Some of the problem is that ultimately the grades you get in school depends on that teacher in university. A lot of people need to come out of university with a 2-1 to know what they do next. So we have a lot of discussion about it. It doesn't matter, but the student that goes, well actually no, it does matter what I need in order to get a 2-1. And I think some of what we maybe do wrong is marking outcome rather than the process.
Yeah.
And I know that they can do
Yeah.
some objective based on some of the design courses, and they have sort of discussions with their externals come saying, this project doesn't look like at first. And they say, well no, but actually what the student's done, and they look much more at the process behind it, and the students take a risk that may go wrong because they have the problem with their students. They're meant to be creative, or they wouldn't do things because it might not work. So they'd rather do something safe that they knew that the end product they could like stick up on the wall or a TV show would be a 2-1. But they wouldn't take the good idea and run with it because they could end up with something that looks like that. Because if something's gone wrong, they wouldn't have time to fix it. Because I think medicine is very short and think a lot in law we do that in what is this finished product rather than how did you do it. So if you're quite good at flagging an entry or something, you might get away with it and get a 2-1 whatever with very little effort, whereas you could be working really hard on something,
What's the process?
doing the right thing.
This is the discussion.
It's how you capture
Carolina,
that.
we come back to this discussion. This is, I think, really, really important.
Yeah.
The Scottish baccalaureate in schools as well, we're thinking of through the SPA is very interesting because it's very much like that. Because I've had a couple of people sitting through social subjects in the last couple of years.
And the end product, they don't look at. So the SK don't want that. They just want their, how did you go about doing this, your self-reflection on this, how did you feel, what were your pitfalls, what were your dependencies, what was even, and teaching the learner to go through it. They need their advanced hires as well.
Are you a fan of the Scott Back?
Sorry?
Are you a fan of Scott Back?
Yes and no. I like it. I think the pupils, depending on the project, they will go out of it. I think the self-evaluation is quite good. But there are parts of it. It's quite a lot of workload for a teacher. You have to be heavily invested in one pupil. There's not a lot of pupils to do it. So it's quite limiting, I think, from that because of the teacher input and the regular grade, etc. But it can be really good, yeah.
I've had perhaps a skewed version of it, and I've just seen the pupils who have finished it and did a really good job when they present are being blown away by the work that they've done. But you're right, it's quite a lot of mentoring work there, and try to replicate that on a broader scale is really, really difficult. And I didn't see the ones where the pupils gave up on it and stopped. So I like it, but what you're saying confirms some of my suspicions with it, is just how accessible is it for everyone, and will it be a game changer? It is process driven, yeah.
As a teacher, I was very like, the first year we did it, was a girl that did a blog, and it was a brilliant blog that National Bike Groups have used in their research for their assessments. And I thought, oh, this is really good, I'll send this off. And I was like, oh, you know. You know, but that's the way I was conditioned.
Yeah.
To see the importance of it.
Well, what I'm coming back to this, what I'm suggesting with low stakes is just to get people to see assessment as a form of practice and a chance to get better. So it's not like the match on Saturday at 3 o'clock. It's kind of like the training session where you have a bit of a penalty shootout or something. So simple ways to do this. I use Kahoot quite a lot because my kids don't see it as a test, but it is a test. That's basically what it is. It's just kind of, it's something that they're quite happy to do. And Carolina gave a great talk yesterday talking about educational research findings in cognitive psychology, and especially looking at space practice and so on. And this is a simple way to do it. This is from Kate Jones, and this is a terrific thing, a retrieval practice challenge grid. So you can do this at the start of a lesson, nice and straightforward. And the idea is that the different colors relate to when pupils learn the materials. So they only get 1 point for something they learned last week, but they get last lesson, 2 points for last week, 3 points for 2 weeks ago, and 4 points for further back. So you can run that any way you want in a lesson. And yes, again, it's a test, but it's making use of research findings and how pupils learn better. And that's what I mean by low stakes or no stakes testing. You're not taking in the marks at the end, but you're getting in the habit of practicing. And if they start to do it themselves, because you can give them all the cahoots and they can go and do it at home, then that's great. If self-regulating learners means much at all, it's that they want to take on the practice themselves so that they can get better. They can use assessment themselves. They don't actually necessarily need the teacher there, and they welcome the challenge of it. So they stop getting freaked out by tests quite so much. So there's really simple things to do. And again, if you're interested in doing that and your teachers, there's a whole load of templates that were set up by Mark Anderson, ICT evangelist, so you could just download them. It doesn't add to your workload to make that because it's already there for you. You just need to knock in the questions. So it's quite a straightforward way of doing it. So that's what I mean by just retrieval practice is low stakes testing, and that's where I think Bjork's onto something. Also, again, what I mentioned earlier was the problem of sort of formative assessment actually is kind of summative in disguise. And this is a classic exam question, the sort of thing you get as an historian. To what extent was the February Revolution in 1917 caused by the weak leadership of the Tsar? So it might be a topic that you teach in kind of August, September time, and straight away you'll say to them, right, do an essay. But actually, okay, the knowledge, that might not be summative in the knowledge, but it is on the overall skills of writing an essay if you're new to higher history. So what I realized when I was teaching a lot of A-level and IB, when I just thought, you know what, no wonder the first set of essays I take in are rubbish, because they're not ready to write at that level yet, and there's a lot of different moving parts to an essay. So let's break it down. Let's say, okay, guys, let's write an introduction. Let's see what we've got. Let's see if we can engage with the question fully, take it apart, throw out some issues for it, and once we've learned how to write a good introduction, then we'll think about writing the rest of the essay. Maybe we'll do that in a month's time. Or we can actually, I like doing this drill, write a 7-minute paragraph. So you can plan the essay as a class, and you can say, right, we're going to talk about 3 factors. We're going to talk about impact of the First World War. We're going to talk about the leadership of the Tsar. We're going to talk about the rising opposition, domestic and social conditions. And say, right, pick one of those, and 7 minutes, go for it. Write your paragraph. Because actually, if you can write a good paragraph in 7 minutes of about 150 words, then you're probably going to be fine in just about any exam setting, really. So you can tackle it in that kind of a way. It's a little bit more of a drill that when you try and tackle the whole thing, again, same thing, write a conclusion. Okay, let's skip over the intro and the 7-minute paragraphs, but let's just say, what would your 1-sentence answer be to that question overall, and how would you justify it? And how can you do that in 100-odd words? So once they learn to do the different moving parts, then you can start fitting it together. And that's when formative then can lead to summative. But if you start with a summative, then it suddenly becomes a bit of an angry slog for a lot of the kids. And we need to draw a distinction between the two again. Also, something I've changed in my practice is using multiple choice questions. So we're talking about this yesterday. The first 10 years of my teaching, I would never have done this. I swore blind I would never use multiple guess questions because you don't know how the students have actually got to the answer, so it's a complete waste of time. But actually, I've realized that they are very good. It was Daisy who put me onto this when I heard her speaking at Research Ed about it, and I thought, maybe she's got something, I'll try it out. But the things I find it useful for, firstly is actually, as Christina was saying yesterday, get the pupils to think about why something is the right answer or why it's the wrong answer. So in this case, this is one I do with my Nat 5 pupils. And which of the following reasons was not a cause of lack of integration for Italian immigrants to Scotland? Now this was an interesting one because some of them didn't know what the word integration was. It was the first time they'd properly come across it in this context. So although we covered the content, they had to think, well, what does that mean? So some of them couldn't answer it, and when we looked back at it and went through it and I talked to them about it, 2 of them said, yeah, I didn't know what that meant. And they confused it with immigrants. So they thought about lack of immigration. How can we lack of immigration? They did come. So they had to go and think about that. And it builds on their vocabulary skills. And if you read Alex Quigley's book about bridging the vocabulary gap, it's fantastic. And there's a brilliant chapter in there on disciplinary literacy, talking about the different modes of language and communication subject by subject that really make a big difference. I think every teacher should have a look at. Because if you're talking about whole school literacy, then that's a great starting point. It's really impressive stuff from Alex. So in this case, we've got 3 answers. There are actually reasons why Italians didn't integrate straight away, and one that isn't. So actually, when you go through it, it's not like, oh, tick, you got it right. You go through it and say, okay, well, language. What did Italians do when they came to Scotland? Well, actually, they kept their own language. They didn't see themselves as being long-term migrants, so we can ally that to aiming to return home. They saw it as a temporary thing. They didn't want to engage with Scottish culture. And actually, because of that, that meant they were more likely to marry within their own communities, so they stayed fairly tight-knit. The thing is, they never actually managed to get back home for the most part, so they ended up staying in the longer term. Which leaves us with stripe breaking, and the reason that's the wrong answer is because Italians didn't tend to engage in heavy industry, so they weren't down coal mines, and they weren't out in the shipyards and so on. They were forming their own small businesses, fish and chip shops and ice cream parlors and things like this. So actually, if we unpack all of that, what we've got is stripe breaking, giving them a bit of knowledge, but the other three, because they know that there are reasons why they did, and we've improved their language, they've actually got a mini essay plan there for the 6-mark question, which is explain why Italians or any other group, Lithuanians, Jewish, struggle to integrate with Scottish society. So there's an awful lot that can come out of that. And I also think that if you present students with 4 or 5 or whatever possible answers, and one of them's right and the rest are wrong, and they don't recognize the one that's right, you know for certain they don't know it. So actually focus on the ones that they get wrong. I know that sounds quite a negative thing to say, but it helps you understand why they're not getting something or what knowledge is missing that's preventing them from understanding. So I find it quite useful. I do it quite a lot now. I don't do exclusively multiple choice tests. I do recall, and then I do sort of multiple choice and put them alongside, and it also tells me whether the recall is better than the multiple choice or not, because that's another useful diagnostic as well. And what I'm finding is there's not usually a big difference. Pupils do slightly better, but I try and make this tougher, and I try and put in language that's more complicated. So by practicing this, not only are they getting knowledge recall, but they're also developing their linguistic skills, because reading the question is really important. Carl Hendrick wrote a great blog last week about pupils in an English exam where the word vocation was used, and the question was describe your favorite vocation, something like that. And a lot of pupils didn't know the word, so they thought it was vacation, the same thing. So they wrote a completely wrong answer because it was about the last holiday that they'd had. And it's that kind of literacy that is an issue which you can test by having questions like that. I love this list from Sarah Donarski. If you ask a boring question, you're going to get a boring answer. So she threw out things to play with. This is exam questions by and large are boring. That one I've just shown you about, what was the main reason for the fall of the government in February 1917. It's such a stock question, and it's just okay, great, and it follows a set format and everything else. So she came up with this list that she tries to use to spark a bit of discussion in her class. I love some of these. How great is that? Which Shakespearean character is closest to Donald Trump? Discuss. God, that's a good pub conversation if ever there was one. Number 2, in what ways could one argue that Wham's Last Christmas is written about Hamlet? Go away and have a think about that one on your way home. So this is about actually throwing some questions at them, really off-the-wall ones that spark thinking and understanding, as opposed to just kind of let's trot out the knowledge and let's write an exam-based question, because you can't really write exam-based answers to this. You can really get them to play around with their knowledge and have a fantastic classroom debate about that. So ask different, better questions. Vary what you're giving them. Spark it up a little bit. Put them out of what is a regular kind of like, okay, if I ask you this question and it's quite straightforward and it's going to somehow pop up in an exam paper later on, let's ask some wider questions than that. So that's a good little one as well. I like the one at number 9. What role did chemists play in the war? Are they heroes or villains? That's a really good question. I've recently become interested in the chemistry of the First World War and bought a couple of books on it. It reminded me that I should have stuck with chemistry. So yeah, that's some good stuff there. Improving the accuracy, mindful of the time, so I won't show this, but go and have a look at comparative judgment. There's a sort of 3-minute clip of this on YouTube. So this is becoming very big in England. The No More Marking Alliance has been set up. And the idea here is to improve the accuracy of judging kind of large pools of work, probably quite useful in universities, I would have thought, but at the same time is reducing the amount of workload that teachers are doing. So in other words, rather than doing a forensic line-by-line marking, you basically say, you get 2 up on the screen, and you look at them and you say, that's better than that one. And because it's all uploaded by software and lots of teachers look at it, lots of different judgments are made of the same bit of work, and what you end up with is actually a far greater level of accuracy of what are the best pieces of work as opposed to the middle as opposed to the ones at the bottom. And again, it takes out a lot of those biases that goes along with marking a piece of work where you're marking a bit of work by a good student because you taught them. So you might actually overlook some of the bits that weren't quite so good, and equally the ones that have underperformed but suddenly pulled out at the end, you might not notice that quite so much. So it's quite an interesting approach. I haven't used it myself, but I'm just saying have a look at it. It's a different way of doing things, and that's the sort of thing that'd be interesting to consider.
Problem with that, our assignments were great related criteria. I'm not sure with that anyway, but
Yeah.
great related criteria was that would be an example of normative.
Yeah, it's trying to break away from sort of rubric culture, but you still have to give a valid reason why you think one piece of work is better than another. Yeah. Yeah. So you get basically for the teacher, the workload is crunched down. You also need a group of people doing this to do a very high level, lots of different bits of work. But each bit of work will be judged a lot of times against the other bits of work by a lot of different people, and that's what makes it, the proponents say, more accurate. So there are other ways to do it. We don't necessarily have to stick to the same old methods. Improving feedback, key message marking is not the same thing as feedback, and a lot of people still bang on with this, but I really try and say to everybody, whether new teachers, experienced teachers, please don't see them as being the same thing. And I love this, feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. So if I slog my way through 20 higher history essays and I bang them out at the start of the lesson, they look at the grade and shove them in their folders, then they've spent approximately 30 seconds looking at it probably, and I've spent maybe 10, 12 minutes marking the thing. So that's the wrong way around. The feedback shouldn't be more work for me than it is for them. So Dylan has argued this, and he put this in our book, and when he told us this in the interview, we thought, oh, thank you for giving us that little gift, that's a winner. This has proved really popular. He talks about 4 quarters marking, and he says something that is very contentious. He says that any teacher that does a forensic line-by-line marking of every bit of work that is given to them by every one of their pupils is a bad teacher. It's kind of provocative, but he's not saying that they're bad people or they don't know what they're doing. He's saying that if you are doing that, it's taking up so much of your time that you're not spending enough time planning your lessons because your teacher time is finite. So this becomes a zero-sum game where the marking is taking priority over the lesson planning. So your teaching would be better if you spent less time doing all of that marking. Plus, this is a balanced diet. This involves still doing forensic marking of 25% of what comes in, but skim marking another. I'll show you how you can use skim marking quite effectively in a moment. Self-assessment, but teachers monitor the quality. That allows for live feedback. And then peer assessment, another 25%. Peer assessment is something I never used again in the first sort of 10 years or so that I was teaching, so I just didn't think it worked, and I'd never seen it work very well, but I've tried very hard to make it work, and I find, especially S1, S2, S3, it's fantastic. And actually pupils are quite good critics of work, and it really helps pupils to see another pupil's work that might be better or worse than theirs to help them understand what's good about their own work. So peer assessment I've come to really embrace, having never actually rated it in the first place. Yeah, that's it. And again, it's something that culturally, yes, and that's a really positive thing, and we need to capitalize on that, don't we? Yeah. Yeah, I think when you then start ending up with them wanting the mark scheme to have a look at it and perhaps getting it wrong, they're not examiners. That's the issue. And that's where actually that thing of breaking it down like a full essay into, okay, let's just write the introduction, that can easily be peer assessed. But a whole essay, I wouldn't do that myself, personally. There's a call. And Dylan said about marking, that's why I want to describe marking as the most expensive public relations exercise in history. It's proving to the parents that we're doing our job, and it's showing to the pupils that we care about their work. No teacher should be doing that, really. We're not into PR, we are teachers. So his tip, good old Columbo there, I love Columbo, turning feedback into detective work. This is terrific. So it's the idea of rather than handing it back a bit of work where it's actually stuck on with your red pen or whatever, saying this is good, this is not so good, saying to them if it's a 20 maths question, so right, you've got 5 of them wrong, find out which ones they are. And if you don't know how to do that, then let's pair up with somebody else and look at each other's work and see how to, and that's going to take them a bit of time. So the point of this is that whenever you assess pupils, whether it's in the lesson or it's homework or whatever else, give them time to respond to that and do something with it so they can actually learn from what they've done well and what they haven't done well. But detective work's a good idea. Again, it takes some of the pressure out of it and makes it a little bit more entertaining for them. I'm not saying learning has to be fun or engagement equals learning, because we know there are problems with that. But we want them to seek feedback. That's a positive thing for them to do. So this detective work idea is a good one. David Yeager talks about wise feedback and found there's a massive difference if you explain why feedback is actually given. So if you give the feedback and you say to them, right, why am I telling you this? And you explain it and you go a little bit further with that conversation, it helps an awful lot with pupil motivation and how they respond to that feedback. They don't go away thinking, Mr. Macpherson's an idiot, I can't believe he said that to me. Well, they might do that anyway. But actually, you're basically engaging with them on a better level. It seems to produce good results. And the other thing as well is that the reason why written marking is problematic, it takes a long time to do. I do think feedback has a half-life. So if you give live feedback, that has a lot of effect because the pupil has just written that or just answered the question and you can discuss it with them in the lesson. That's really great. But if they do it and you take it away and hand it back a week later, so much has happened in their life since then, they probably can't even remember what they wrote in the first place. So the feedback, therefore, doesn't have a great deal of impact, and that's quite a problem. So we need to be mindful of that. I once had a colleague who was just terrible at getting marking done, and he actually said, you know what, I'm going to hand this back to the next term so they can see how much they've improved. This is an utter waste of time. Don't do that. Just, if you're going to do marking, get it back to them as quickly as you can, but think about using in-class feedback because it's live and it has much more impact, and it will reduce your workload as well. This is whole class feedback, and I've been using this for about the last year and a half, and I really like it because, again, this is where skim reading the work comes in. So if you read 25 books, you don't have to mark all them line by line, but you can read them, and you just keep one bit of paper by the side, and you're like, right, I've seen 3 people so far didn't understand the question. I've seen 5 people so far who have missed out a key bit of evidence that we talked about in the lesson. And what you do is essentially pick out the headlines, and you can hand back the books and you can say, right, these are the good things that are going on and these are the things that we want to improve. So you're not targeting every single mistake, but you're saying, right, let's work on 3 things specifically. And then you can do your detective work exercise. Right, some of you are misspelling key terms. Look up whenever you use those key terms and see, did you spell them correctly? So it's just things like that that can help you reduce your workload, but also change what they do with the feedback a little bit. I'm not saying doing this all the time, but again, that's kind of like a quarter of the diet. So it's a different way of giving the feedback. I give them, so you can hand out a sheet like that, which is what I will typically do. Or if I'm not going to do it in quite as much depth or don't want such a long bit, because if they do the work and I actually find there's not so much I need to delve into, I'll maybe just put up kind of 3 points at the board and we'll spend 5-10 minutes looking through it. But that's where, again, if I do that, I don't get any data out of it. But I've stopped caring so much about data, so it doesn't matter. I've still got enough data from other things and summative bits of assessment, so I'm not a data desert, but this is saving me a lot of time, and I do think pupils are learning a bit more. So if you look at my books now that my S1 pupils are doing, then they are a lot lighter in terms of marking, and parents could probably say to me, I don't think you mark the books enough, then I'm happy to sit and talk them through this and say, well, actually, these are the different ways that we assess work. I know there are teachers who stamp things and say, this has been peer assessed, or this has been teacher monitored, and so on. No, again, it's PR. I'm not going to do that.
We have a fun challenge at class with 200 plus students.
Mm.
And one of the things that's constantly raised is the lack of practice of working through the question of long form written assessment, written pieces. I would say assessments is that practice of writing. So I've got that in the back of my mind when I'm looking at it and trying to think how that actually.
How would you use it? Yeah. That's interesting. Maybe we should have a chat about it at the end and think about that. But that's where I wonder if the comparative judgment might be useful for you.
Not really. We'll discuss it later, but I think that the piece is big at the scale. It's not on the street. It's big.
You still have full essays when you do the comparative judgment, and you're reading something that's 3-4 pages long, but it creates a logarithm for you that you actually then does the calculations for you when it ranks it. Interesting.
Yeah.
Mm.
Time to do it. It's like us having the time to
Mm.
do things with students quickly enough. And it's quite interesting to sort of get ideas together. But what I found is a lot of getting them to do shorter assessments because you don't often need to be writing as much. So good writing is shorter.
Yeah.
So we're looking to push an awful lot of peer assessment in.
Mhm.
One of them having the chance to complete the structure. Do that.
Mm.
See how that fits next year.
Yeah. Oh, I'd be interested to come back and find out. Yeah.
Every 2 weeks I'll be doing an essay and peer assessing it with a minimal amount of actual staff monitoring. Which will probably come through on the whole class feedback.
Yeah. Because you basically want quality, but you don't want to. You want to find an efficient way of getting there.
Yeah, and there's no way that we should be line by line through. I mean, it's looking at
Yeah.
those 4 quarters, it's thinking you have to set a budget. So many corrections, so many questions you ask about why they're thinking and why they did it.
Mm.
So the feedback actually prompts them to respond.
Mm.
And so much skim reading and just sort of overall quality.
Mm. Quality control is still really important in the whole process, but that's where in lesson time you've got to try and craft things that allow you to do that, which is difficult. I mean, I'm talking about my context, which might be really different exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So what we probably need is somebody to follow up on this talk and say, right, assessment at university level, how do we do that, and teachers could listen and think, right, how do we prepare our pupils for what you're trying to do with them?
University's got another route, this TESTA program, which is developed somewhere else.
Transforming the experience of students through assessment.
And it's a big audit basically across the department, how many hours you spend on assessments. So it's very practical, very procedural. It's just scratching at the surface of what we talk about here, which is the deeper understanding and seeing what's going on. About wondering if the software available to sort of got money, could invest it, and then if that's there, it would make it easier for people to do. It does need big data sets again.
Yeah.
But it's obviously the benefit.
Just got a wall covered with every module and every assessment. Actually, and a room full of that as well. And the confession of parents, I'm paying £9,000 a year, my students only getting this much in. We ask them, well, when is the learning happening?
Perfectly valid question.
When you're talking about supported learning, as in like you might be learning at like in university level, from my experience, you get a lecture and you go away and do the learning where there's a teacher in front of you. Maybe what they're looking for is to do that independent learning with someone there to ask questions. I'm independently learning, but I have someone at hand to say, am I getting this right? Is this okay?
You must see our email boxes.
That must be online, yes, that must be an online system, but then when you have so many people, that's not feasible to do that. So that's the difference, I guess, in schools, that they might have sat with us for an hour. We might not be stood up teaching, but we're there to support them.
Again, a talk for a totally different day is actually how technology can be used to enhance assessment. So again, I did a pilot with the IBO where they were looking at online assessment for the middle years program, which is equivalent to National 5 GCSE, and it was just completely different. It was so different. It wasn't just like a traditional exam paper but stuck on the screen so you type your responses. It was actually like, here's a map and we want you to annotate it on the screen, sort of thing. And here's a short video clip, watch this and then respond to the questions. And you're moving things around in the screen, so it was a mixture of touchscreen and typing, and it just felt so different. But actually it was really quite a stiff test. But of course you've got to get the technology to work and you've got to be able to upscale it and everything else. But I've got the feeling that in 10, 20 years' time, we're going to be looking at really different assessment, really different. Once we harness the once we work out how technology can work for us, then there's some interesting things to do there.
I think that's already out there. It's just not necessarily in this country.
Yes.
Because technologies that I've been using in overseas for learning, for assessment, is there. And you come to the UK and you feel like you've taken a step back in time to some extent. But there's also the understanding and the underpinning of what technology does, and accepting that it's a tool for that learning and for assessment and whatnot. So I think there's a long way to go, but it is there. We just have to kind of take ourselves forward.
Yeah, that's another tile session in the making, isn't it, EdTech?
Very easy to assess knowledge. It's much harder to work out how to automatically assess understanding. That's very challenging.
Yeah, that's the sharp end, isn't it?
And we want to assess understanding. That's what we're about.
I'll skip on. I'm a 90s indie kid, so I use references like this, the band Cast. So on feedback, I think it should be clear so people understand it. It should be actionable. They should do something with it. It should be specific, so rather than vague. Daisy uses the great example of, it's like giving a stand-up comedian feedback of be more funny. Which, if they know how to do that, they've done it in the first place. And then it needs to be timely, so that again, you haven't forgotten the work that you did. The feedback is irrelevant if you can't even remember what it was that you were being assessed on. So it does bring us to the end, having overshot a little bit. My apologies for that, but it's been a really interesting discussion with you today. This is, as I said, the final line of Camus' the Myth of Sisyphus, and he says, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. So my disagreement is I'm scoring that one out and that one out, and I'm putting make teachers happy, and that was me that said that. So there you go. Thank you very much, everybody. I will stick around for questions, but if people need to shoot off, that's absolutely fine. So yeah.